The first thing Talveka noticed was the silence. She had served on warships for 11 years. She had heard the low hum of engines in deep space, the rhythmic clicking of the Sarathi, the cacophony of crowded mess halls, and the low-frequency vibration of weapons charging before a battle. She knew the sound of a living ship, and with a cold, heavy certainty settling in her chest, she knew that the silence pressing against the hull of the pale silence was not natural. This was the silence of something that was listening. She stood at her post in the reconnaissance department. Her forelimbs glided across the data panels before her. There was nothing unusual on the screens. Star charts, radiation readings, gravitational maps of the region ahead. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. But Talveka could not shake the feeling that they had already made a terrible mistake. The Pale Silence. The Pale Silence was a reconnaissance cruiser of the Sarathi Dominion, one of the finest ships in the fleet. It was long, dark, and shaped like a blade, built for speed and stealth. On board was a crew of 412, all loyal soldiers of the Supreme Matriarchy. It was accompanied by 6 smaller combat ships, flying in a tight formation around it like protective insects guarding their queen. Together, they comprised the 3rd Deep Reconnaissance Group, sent to the edge of known space to do something no one in the galaxy had dared do in generations. They were sent to probe Russian space. Talveka opened the mission briefing on her screen for the 20th time that day. The orders had come directly from the Supreme Matriarchy, sealed with the signet of the Supreme Mother herself. The language was formal and cold, as all Sarathi military orders were, but Talveka could read the hunger between the lines. The Dominion of Rus. Over the last galactic cycle, it had absorbed 17 cosmic civilizations, consuming their worlds, their resources, and their peoples. The Sarathi were not cruel in this. They were simply efficient. They saw the galaxy as a garden, and themselves as the gardeners. Everything that grew in the garden either served the garden or was pulled out by the roots. But there was a part of the garden the Sarathi had never touched, a region of the spiral arm that sat quiet and still, surrounded by warning buoys broadcasting in 12 languages. Russian space, a settled territory, the United Earth nations and their colonies, scattered across a modest but well-defended stretch of stars. The matriarchy wanted to know if the humans were as dangerous as everyone said, and if not, how quickly they could be absorbed. Talveka closed the briefing and opened her reconnaissance files instead. This was her job. She was an analyst, trained to study hostile civilizations and find their weaknesses. She had done this for the Horovat, the Dren, and the Void Singers of Battlejuice. She was very good at it. She could look at a species and see where it was soft, where it was fragile, where it would break. But the Russian files made her uncomfortable. It wasn't what the files contained. It was what they didn't contain. There were thousands of pages of data on human biology, their history, their culture, their political structure. The Sarathi had been collecting intelligence on humans for over a century. But when it came to their military capabilities, the files became thin, hesitant, filled with assumptions and guesses. Phrases like "are presumably capable of" and "unconfirmed reports" suggest. No one knew what the humans were truly capable of, and the reason was simple and terrible. Everyone who had gone to find out either returned, broken, or didn't return at all. Talveka scrolled through the records. The Dret Combine had sent a slave fleet of 40 ships 300 years ago. None returned. The Horovat Empire had launched a full-scale invasion with 200 warships. They were neutralized in 11 minutes. The Bright Corps, a hive mind species that had terrorized an entire galactic sector, had tried to infiltrate Russian space with a bioship the size of a small moon. It was found 3 weeks later drifting in open space, completely empty. Every living cell inside it was dead, and those were only the ones documented. There were rumors of others pirates who strayed too close, smugglers who ignored the warnings, research vessels that became curious. All disappeared. All went silent. The galactic community called the region around Russian space the Quiet. By an unwritten rule of the galaxy, the only thing everyone agreed upon from the elder races to the youngest spacefaring civilization was simple: you do not enter the Quiet. Talveka understood this. She had studied it. She had written reports on it. And when she was assigned to this mission, she had gone to fleet headquarters and said, respectfully but firmly, that it was a mistake. Ishrel had not listened. The commander now stood on the bridge, standing in the center of the command platform, her 6 legs spread wide and her thoracic section held high. She was old for a Sarathi warrior. Her carapace was scarred and darkened with age, but her eyes were sharp, and her mandibles were strong. She had conquered 3 civilizations for the matriarchy. She had earned her rank with blood and brilliance, and she was afraid not of the humans, but of the matriarchy. She was afraid of returning empty-handed, of admitting that the Sarathi Dominion, the greatest military power in the known galaxy, was too scared to even glance at a young species that had only existed in space for a few centuries. And that fear drove her forward like a whip, making her deaf to the warnings. "How long to the buoy perimeter?" Ishrel asked. Her voice was clicking and sharp. The navigator checked his instruments. 6 standard hours, Commander." "Good. Maintain course and speed. All ships in formation." Talveka watched from her post and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. She had voiced her objections. They had been noted and dismissed. Now, all that remained was to observe, to record, and to hope that the humans were not as terrible as everyone thought. The hours passed slowly. Talveka spent them reading. She reread the Russian files, looking for what she might have missed. She studied their biology. They were soft creatures, warm-blooded, with 2 arms and 2 legs. They had no natural armor, poison, or claws worth mentioning. By Sarathi standards, they were physically unremarkable. One Sarathi soldier could tear a human apart in close combat without much effort. But the files also noted something else. Humans were persistent. They did not give up. They did not stop. When they were wounded, they healed. When they were knocked down, they rose again. They evolved on a world that actively tried to kill them, a planet of earthquakes, volcanoes, predators, and disease. And they didn't just survive. They conquered it completely. Every ocean, every mountain, every desert, every frozen wasteland. They bent their world to their will through nothing but stubbornness, cunning, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge defeat. Then, they looked at the stars and decided to do the same. Talveka found it unsettling. The Sarathi were strong because there were many of them, because they reproduced quickly and fought fiercely, suppressing their enemies through numbers and coordination. But humans were strong for a different reason. They were strong because they simply refused to be weak. "Commander," the sensor officer said suddenly, "we are approaching the buoy perimeter." The bridge fell silent. Every officer looked up from their post. On the main display, the star map showed a line of small, blinking dots stretching out before them. "Display the warning buoys," Ishrel ordered. The display shifted, showing the view ahead. They were small, the buoys, barely larger than a Sarathi escape pod. They floated in a long, even line, spaced at identical intervals, stretching in both directions as far as the sensors could see. Each pulsed with a soft blue light, and each was broadcasting. The communications officer touched his panel, and the bridge filled with the sound, a calm, clear, and absolutely dispassionate voice speaking in perfect Sarathi. The pronunciation was flawless. The grammar was precise. It sounded as if a Sarathi elder were reading a sacred text. "You are approaching the Russian administrative space. Identify yourselves and state your intentions. Unauthorized entry is prohibited. If you do not identify yourselves, you are advised to change course immediately. There will be no second warning." This message repeats. The voice stopped. Then it began again, word for word. It wasn't a recording made by a Sarathi. It was a Russian system, speaking their language with flawless fluency. And that small detail was, for some reason, more terrifying than everything Talveka had read in the reconnaissance files. They knew the Sarathi language. They spoke it perfectly, which meant they had been studying the Sarathi likely for a very long time, and the Sarathi hadn't even noticed. "Cut the transmission," Ishrel said. "It is noise, nothing more." The communications officer cut the sound, and silence returned to the bridge. But it was a different silence now. Heavier, charged with something Talveka recognized as fear. "Commander," Talveka said carefully. Permission to speak denied. Ishrel didn't even look at her. "All ships, maintain formation. We cross the perimeter in 2 minutes." Talveka felt her hearts beating rapidly, pounding in her chest like drums. She looked around the bridge and saw the same fear in the eyes of every officer. They were soldiers. They were trained. They were loyal. But they were also alive. And every living creature in the galaxy, on some deep, primal level, knew that crossing into Russian space was not something one did if they wanted to stay alive. The pale silence crossed the line. The buoys remained behind, still blinking, still broadcasting their warning to the empty cosmos. Ahead, there was nothing, only stars, only the cold, ordinary vacuum of deep space. But it didn't feel ordinary. It felt like entering a dark room when you know with absolute certainty that someone is already there, someone who can see you perfectly, even though you cannot see them at all. "Sensor sweep," Ishrel ordered. "Full spectrum, and I want to know everything within a 10-light-year radius." The sensor officer worked his instruments. Talveka watched his upper limbs tremble slightly as he adjusted the controls. The results came back quickly. "Nothing, Commander. No ships, no stations, no energy signatures. The area is completely empty." "You see?" Ishrel said, a hint of triumph in her voice. "Empty space. Humans rely on fear and reputation. There is nothing here." But Talveka was looking at her own screens, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice. The long-range sensors were picking up ghost signatures, faint echoes of energy that appeared and vanished too quickly to track. They were everywhere, scattered across the sensor grid like reflections on water. Each lasted less than a heartbeat, each was in a different place, and each, when Talveka ran the analysis, matched the energy profile of a ship. Not one ship, not 10 hundreds, maybe thousands, flickering into existence around them like shadows. Watching from dimensions the Sarathi sensors could barely detect. They were surrounded. They had been surrounded from the moment they crossed the perimeter, maybe even before. "Commander," Talveka said, and this time she did not ask for permission. "You need to see this." Ishrel turned, annoyance written on her face. But before she could speak, every light on the bridge flickered, just for a moment long enough to notice. And in that moment of darkness, every screen at every post displayed the same thing. 2 words, written in the Sarathi military font, used only for high-level secret communications, a font no alien species should have been able to access. The words read, "You were warned." Then the lights returned, the screens went back to normal, and the bridge of the pale silence filled with the sound of 400 hearts beating very, very fast. Ishrel stared at the screens, her mandibles opening and closing. For the first time since Talveka had known her, the commander had nothing to say. The silence pressed in around them, heavy, patient, and immense. And the pale silence flew deeper into Russian space, carrying its crew toward something none of them understood, but all of them feared. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, something was watching them and waiting. 3 days had passed since they crossed the buoy perimeter, and the pale silence had not been attacked. Not a shot was fired, not a single enemy ship appeared. Nothing had happened, and that was the worst part. Talveka hadn't slept properly since the message appeared on the bridge screens. Neither had most of the crew. She saw it in their eyes, in the way they moved through the compartments, in the way conversations would die the moment someone mentioned where they were. Fear had settled into the ship like a disease, quiet, spreading, and no amount of discipline could cure it. Ishrel pretended not to notice. The commander spent her time on the bridge, studying star charts and giving orders with the same sharp confidence as always. But Talveka noticed that Ishrel had stopped sleeping too. She noticed the commander's mandibles twitching nervously when she thought no one was watching. She noticed Ishrel quietly ordering the weapons officer to keep all systems in a state of full readiness at all times, even though they were supposedly in empty space with no enemies. The ghost signatures continued. Every few hours, Talveka's sensors picked up another shimmer of energy, another phantom ship, appearing and disappearing at the edge of detection. She stopped reporting them to Ishrel. The commander didn't want to hear it. She had decided the signatures were sensor glitches, natural phenomena, anything but what they clearly were. They were being watched, they were being stalked, and whatever was stalking them was making sure they knew it. On the morning of the 4th day, the sensor officer called Talveka to the bridge. His voice was strange, not scared, but stunned. Something beyond fear. Something that had passed through fear and come out on the other side into a kind of numb disbelief. "You need to see this," he said. "Everyone needs to see this." Talveka stepped onto the bridge and stopped in the doorway. Every officer on duty stood motionless, staring at the main display. No one spoke, no one moved. They just stood there, looking at what the sensors had found. And Talveka looked too, and she understood why no one could speak. Ships, hundreds of ships, filling the space ahead like a forest of dead trees. They drifted in the vacuum, dark, cold, and silent. Some were enormous, the size of a small moon. Their hulls were scarred and torn. Others were smaller, frigates that were twisted and broken into shapes that no longer made sense. They were of all designs, all styles, all materials. Talveka recognized Hrovat dreadnoughts with their distinctive blade-shaped bows. She saw Dret slave ships, their cargo bays open and empty. She saw vessels of species she could not identify, designs she had never seen, ships from civilizations that had been erased so completely from the galaxy that even their names did not survive. A graveyard. She had read about it in secret files, those the matriarchy had labeled as unconfirmed intel rumors from long-range cosmic traders and terrified diplomats. A place where the humans kept the remains of every fleet that had ever crossed into their space uninvited. A monument and a warning, floating in the dark for anyone foolish enough to come looking. The rumors were true, and the reality was worse than any story. "How many?" Ishrel asked. Her voice was steady, but Talveka could hear the strain in it. The commander was holding on by sheer willpower. "More than 600 vessels confirmed," said the sensor officer, "spread over an area of about 2 cubic light hours. Some are very old, centuries old. Others are newer." He paused. "Commander, some of them are Sarathi." The bridge went very quiet. "What?" Ishrel asked. 3 vessels of Sarathi design, military configuration. They match the profile of the Long Watch, which disappeared in this region 90 years ago. The one that was officially declared lost due to a navigational error. Talveka remembered the Long Watch. Every Sarathi child learned about it 30 brave soldiers who had ventured into the unknown and never returned. The matriarchy had told the people that they had been lost to the dangers of deep space, that it was a tragedy, and their sacrifice would not be forgotten. But the truth, the real truth, was floating right in front of them, dark and dead among the ruins of hundreds of other foolish expeditions. The matriarchy had lied. They knew what happened to the Long Watch. They knew, and they had sent Ishrel and the 3rd Deep Reconnaissance Group anyway. Talveka looked at Ishrel and saw the same realization in the commander's eyes. The matriarchy hadn't sent them to collect intelligence. They had sent them to see if the humans were still paying attention. They were bait. "Nothing more than bait, Commander," Talveka said softly. "We should turn back." Ishrel was silent for a long time. Then she straightened her thoracic section and clicked her mandibles sharply. "We will investigate. Prepare a boarding team. I want to know what happened to these ships." Talveka wanted to argue. She wanted to scream. But she was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. So she gathered a team of 12 and took a shuttle through the dark space between the pale silence and the nearest drifting ship. They chose a Hrovat dreadnought, one of the largest vessels in the field. It was massive up close, nearly 3 kilometers in length. Its armor plating was thick and heavy. The Hrovat were famous for their warships. They built them to last, designing them to withstand punishment that would tear other vessels apart. This ship looked like it could have fought for 1,000 years, but it was dead completely, absolutely dead. No power, no heat, no atmosphere. It drifted in the vacuum like a stone at the bottom of an ocean. When Talveka's shuttle docked with the nearest airlock, the sound of the magnetic clamps engaging echoed through the hull like a heartbeat in an empty chest. The boarding team entered in full vacuum suits, weapons at the ready, flashlights cutting through the absolute darkness inside the ship. The corridors were undamaged. That was the first thing Talveka noticed. No battle damage, no scorch marks from energy weapons, no hull breaches, no signs of any conventional attack. The ship hadn't been destroyed. It had simply been turned off. "This makes no sense," muttered Sergeant Creel, the team's combat specialist. He was a large Sarathi, heavily armored, with scars on his carapace from a dozen campaigns. He wasn't easily frightened, but his voice was strained and uncertain as he scanned the corridor with his weapon light. "Where is the damage? Where is the battle?" "There was no battle," Talveka said. She felt it in the stillness of the ship. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't a fight. It was something else. They found the crew on the command deck. They were still at their posts. Every one of them. The captain in his chair, the weapons officer at his console, the navigation team at their instruments. They were perfectly preserved, encased in an amber substance that had hardened around them like glass. Their bodies were intact, their uniforms were flawless, their hands still reaching for the controls, frozen in the middle of what they were doing when it happened. And their faces. Talveka would never forget their faces. The Hrovat were a reptilian species, cold-blooded and hard-scaled, not prone to strong facial expressions. But every crew member on that bridge wore the same expression, burned into their features like a brand. Their eyes were wide, their mouths were open, their claws were extended. gripping their consoles so hard the metal had bent under the pressure. They were in terror. They were frozen in the moment of their greatest fear, preserved forever in that instant of absolute horror, and whatever they had seen in that final moment was still there in their eyes, staring through the amber like a warning to everyone who would come after. Creel stepped back. What did this to them? Talveka didn't answer. She was staring at the ship's data console. Unlike the crew, the computer systems weren't encased in amber. They were just dead, no power, but structurally undamaged. She plugged in her portable data drive and began to extract whatever remained in the memory banks. Most of it was corrupted. Time and power failure had destroyed the files beyond recovery. But she found fragments, pieces of the ship's log, sensor readings from the final hours. She pieced them together while the rest of the team searched the ship, and the picture that formed made her feel sick. The Hrovat fleet had entered Russian space with 200 warships, 200 of the most powerful vessels their empire had ever built, with a crew of the best soldiers armed with weapons that had conquered a dozen worlds. They had come to seize Russian space by force, confident in their strength, confident that no young species could stand against the might of the Hrovat Empire. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Talveka read the sensor logs 3 times to make sure she wasn't mistaken. 11 minutes from the first contact with humans to the total shutdown of the last Hrovat ship. 11 minutes to neutralize 200 warships. And the log showed something else that turned the cold in Talveka's blood into ice. The humans didn't use the same method twice. Every ship had been disabled differently. On some, the power systems were remotely shut down, as if the humans had reached inside and simply flipped a switch. On others, weapons were dismantled at the molecular level. Components crumbled into dust while the rest of the ship remained untouched. Others were wrapped in fields that stopped all motion, freezing everyone on board instantly. Each method was adapted to the specific ship. Each approach was designed for the specific systems of that vessel, for the specific physiology of that crew. The humans hadn't just defeated the Hrovat fleet. They had studied each ship individually, understood it completely, and then taken it apart with the precision of a surgeon removing a diseased organ. This wasn't a war. It was something beyond war. It was a species that had turned defense into an art so advanced that it didn't even look like combat. It looked like a natural disaster. It looked as if the universe itself had decided the Hrovat fleet should cease to exist, and the universe had done exactly that. Talveka downloaded everything she could and ordered the team to return to the shuttle. They moved quickly through the dark corridors, their lights bouncing off the walls, their breathing loud in their helmets. No one spoke. No one needed to. They had all seen the same thing, and they all understood the same truth. The humans didn't fight wars. They ended them completely, instantly, and with a precision that suggested they had planned for every specific enemy long before that enemy had even decided to attack. Back on the pale silence, Talveka presented her findings to Ishrel. She laid out the data clearly and thoroughly. The graveyard, the Hrovat logs, the 11 minutes, the adapted methods. She explained what it all meant, and watched the commander's face as the reality of their situation enveloped her like a shroud. "We need to leave," Talveka said. "Commander, there is nothing to be gained here. The humans are beyond anything we can handle. The matriarchy must be told the truth." Ishrel was silent for a long time. She stood by the viewport of her private quarters, looking out at the field of dead ships, and Talveka saw the war happening behind her eyes, pride against fear, duty against survival. The commander was a warrior, born and raised, and every instinct told her to stand her ground, to go forward, to never show weakness. But she was also smart, and she saw the evidence. "If we return empty-handed," Ishrel said slowly, "the matriarchy will execute us. If we continue," Talveka replied, "the humans won't execute us. We will simply cease to exist." Ishrel turned away from the viewport. Her eyes were hard. Her mandibles clicked once, twice, 3 times. Then she straightened and walked past Talveka to the bridge. "All ships," she ordered, "maintain course. Increase speed to maximum." Talveka closed her eyes. She had tried. She had done everything she could, and now they flew deeper into the darkness, past the graveyard of every fool who had come before them, toward what waited in the heart of Russian space. She returned to her post and found a message waiting on her personal communicator. This should have been impossible. The communicator was a closed system, encrypted with Sarathi military codes, connected only to the ship's internal network. No external signal should have reached it. But it was there, clear and simple, written in Sarathi's script so perfect it could have come from the matriarchy's own scribe. It said, "You have seen what happens. You can still leave." Talveka stared at the message for a long time. Then she looked up at the main display, where the stars ahead burned cold and bright, and wondered if the humans were offering kindness or showing her how deeply they had already penetrated their systems. She wondered if there was any difference. The pale silence flew on, and the dead ships of the graveyard remained behind, and the silence ahead became deeper, wider, and more absolute. Talveka sat at her post and waited for what would happen next, because there was nothing else she could do. The humans had given their warning. They had shown evidence. They had even offered a way out. And the Sarathi, because they were proud and because they feared the wrong things, had chosen to continue. Somewhere in the darkness, the silence shifted, not louder, not quieter, just different, patient in a new way, as if something enormous and invisible had slowly taken a breath and was now, very carefully, starting to pay attention. Long before the Sarathi Dominion existed, long before the Horavat built their first warship or the Dret Combine took their first slave, humanity first made contact with the galaxy. It did not go well. The year was 2089 by the human calendar. The colony ship New Dawn settled on a green and gentle world in a system humans called Koran, after one of their ancient myths about the transition between life and death. It was a small colony, only about 10,000 people. Farmers, scientists, teachers, children. They had traveled for decades through the void to find a new home, and they had found it. For 3 years, they lived in peace and built something beautiful. Then, the Dret Combine arrived. The Dret were slavers. That was their entire economy, their entire culture, the entire reason for their existence. They moved through the galaxy like a plague, attacking weaker species and taking everything. Their ships arrived in the Koran system without warning, blocked all communications, and landed troops on the surface before the colonists even realized what was happening. What followed was documented in the Dret's own records, because the Dret were proud of their work and kept detailed logs of every harvest. They separated the colonists by age and health. The strong were taken for labor, the skilled for specialized work, the children for breeding stock, to be raised in Dret facilities and taught obedience. The old and the sick, those who had no economic value, were processed. It was a word the Dret used, processed. It meant something Talveka did not want to think about too closely. The Koran colony was devastated in 6 hours. 10,000 human lives were scattered across Dret space like seeds thrown into a fire. Buildings were dismantled for materials. Gardens were burned. New Dawn, the ship that had carried those people across the stars to their new home, was cut up for scrap. Earth learned what happened almost a year later. Communications in those early days were slow, and the Dret had destroyed the colony's relay stations. When the next transport ship arrived and found only ash and empty buildings, humans didn't understand at first. They thought it was a natural disaster, an accident, a disease. Then they found the Dret records. The Dret, in their arrogance, didn't bother to hide what they had done. They recorded the harvest of the Koran colony just as they recorded every other harvest, and those records were transmitted over their communication networks without any encryption, because who would care? Humans were a small, weak, newly spacefaring species. They had no allies, they had no fleet, they had nothing. Earth received the Dret records, read them, and understood exactly what had been done to 10,000 humans. And that day, something changed in the human species, something fundamental, permanent, and terrible. At first, there was grief. Grief so vast and deep that it touched every human living on every planet, every station, ship, and habitat. 10,000 names read aloud on every broadcast channel. 10,000 faces shown on every screen. Humans mourned their dead as they did everything else, completely and without restraint. And the galaxy, which had not paid much attention to the small species at the edge of the spiral arm, did not notice the mourning or what followed. What followed was rage, not the hot, searing, reckless rage that consumed other species when they were wronged. Human rage was different. It was cold. It was patient. It was the rage of a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history being hunted by things larger, faster, and stronger than itself, and had survived not through greater strength, but through greater determination, cunning, and a greater willingness to endure. Humans did not immediately build a war fleet and rush into Dret space for revenge. That was what the Dret expected if they expected anything at all. That was what most species would have done. Instead, humans went quiet. For 50 years, humanity turned inward. They sealed their borders. They stopped exploring. They stopped trading. They ceased communication with the few alien species they had established contact with. To the rest of the galaxy, it looked like humans had retreated into their shell, frightened by their first encounter with the reality of an interstellar civilization. Some species laughed at this. Others forgot about humans entirely. But inside that shell, behind those sealed borders, humanity transformed. They poured all their resources into two things: understanding the galaxy and making themselves impossible to destroy. They studied every species they could collect data on. Their intelligence networks, even in those early days, were extraordinary. They sent probes so small they could not be detected by any known sensor technology. They intercepted communications. They mapped political structures, military capabilities, and cultural weaknesses of every civilization within 1,000 light years. And they built weapons that didn't look like weapons. They built defenses that didn't look like defenses. They built systems so advanced that even the elder races species that had traveled between the stars for millions of years would later look at them with something akin to awe. 50 years after Koran, the Dret Combine sent another fleet into Russian space, expecting to find more easy prey. The fleet was never heard from again. No ship returned, no signal escaped. The Dret sent scouts to investigate, and those scouts also disappeared. They sent a full-scale armada, the largest military force they had ever assembled, and that armada disappeared just as completely and just as quietly as smoke in the wind. The Dret Combine collapsed within a decade. Not because humans attacked them. Humans never attacked anyone. The Dret collapsed because they couldn't replace the ships and soldiers they had lost, and because the rest of the galaxy, seeing what had happened, began to wonder if the humans would come for them next, and stopped doing business with the Dret out of pure self-preservation. But the humans didn't come for anyone. They stayed behind their borders. They set out their warning buoys and published one document, broadcast on all frequencies, in all the languages they had learned, which they called the Koran Doctrine. Talveka had read the doctrine many times. She had memorized it. It was short, clear, and absolute. All beings are welcome in Russian space. Those who come in peace and declare themselves are greeted. Those who enter without invitation will receive one warning. Those who continue after the warning will be classified as an existential threat to the human species. There will be no proportional response to an existential threat. There will only be the complete elimination of the threat. 4 rules, simple enough for a child to understand. And behind those 4 rules was the full weight of a species that had collectively and permanently decided that what had happened to Koran would never happen again, not to their people, and not to anyone under their protection. Never. The galaxy learned to respect the doctrine, not because they admired it, but because they feared it. The warning buoys broadcast in 12 languages because humans had taken the time to learn 12 languages. The graveyard existed because humans kept the evidence of every violation as a reminder, and the silence around Russian space was not empty. It was full of systems, observers, and weapons that no one outside Russian space fully understood. Talveka thought about all this as the pale silence flew deeper into the darkness. She thought about Koran. She thought about the 10,000 humans who were taken from their homes and torn apart for profit. She thought about the cold, patient, unstoppable rage that followed. And she thought about how the Sarathi Dominion, in its hunger and pride, had decided to poke that rage with a stick. She was in her quarters when the ship's systems began to fail. It started small. The lights in the corridor outside her door flickered. Then the life support system in her section reset, lowering the temperature by a few degrees before returning to normal. Then her personal terminal turned off and restarted on its own. When it turned back on, a file appeared on her desktop that she hadn't put there. It was a crew roster, her crew roster. Every name on the pale silence, with their rank, position, home world, and family connections. Next to each name was a note, written in perfect Sarathi script, listing the crew members' medical conditions, personal fears, and psychological profile. The humans hadn't just studied their ship, they had studied every person on board. They knew about Creel's old combat injury that made his left arm lock up. They knew the navigation officer's fear of confined spaces. They knew the communications officer had a daughter on the home world who was about to enter her first reproductive cycle. They knew everything, and they had placed the file on Talveka's terminal not to threaten, but to show her how thoroughly they were watching. It was a message that said, "We see you, all of you, completely." Talveka took the file to Ishrel. The commander read it in silence. Her mandibles didn't click, her eyes didn't blink. She just read, and when she finished, she placed the tablet on the table and looked at it for a long time. "They are trying to scare us," Ishrel said finally. "They are succeeding," Talveka replied. "Fear is a weapon. It can be used by anyone. That doesn't mean they have the strength to back it up. Commander, with respect, the graveyard suggests otherwise. 600 ships from dozens of species, all neutralized, all kept as evidence. The Hrovat fleet destroyed in 11 minutes. The Dret Combine erased from history. This is not the action of a species that relies on a bluff. The Hrovat were weak, the Dret were arrogant. We, the Sarathi." Ishrel stood up and walked to her viewport, looking out at the stars. "The matriarchy did not send us here to be frightened by ghost stories and old tales. We have orders." Talveka wanted to say that the matriarchy had sent them to die. She wanted to say that Ishrel's pride would kill them all. She wanted to grab the commander and shake her until she understood they were not dealing with an enemy that could be measured by ships, soldiers, and firepower. They were dealing with something completely different, something that had been preparing for this moment for 300 years. But she didn't say any of that, because even as she stood there, the ship shuddered. It wasn't a violent jolt. It was soft, almost delicate, like a hand brushing against the hull, but it traveled through the entire ship from bow to stern, and every system on every deck flickered in unison. Then the main engines shut down, not the way engines fail, with alarms, warnings, and emergency protocols. They just stopped. One moment, the pale silence was moving under its own power. The next, it was drifting, carrying forward only by inertia. The backup systems activated automatically, but they were running at half power, and the ship reported something that shouldn't have been possible. The engine shutdown had been initiated from the ship's own systems. The command codes used were Sarathi military codes, active and valid, but they hadn't been entered by anyone on board. Something outside the ship had broken into their most secure systems and used their own codes to turn their engines off. Then the weapons went dark, then the shields, then the communications array. System by system. The pale silence was dismantled from the inside as its own technology was turned against it by an invisible hand that knew every code, every protocol, every weakness. Ishrel stood on the bridge and watched her ship die around her. And for the first time, Talveka saw real fear in the commander's eyes, not the controlled, tactical fear of a soldier facing a known enemy, but raw, primal terror, the horror of a creature realizing it is completely and absolutely helpless. "Turn the engines back on," Ishrel ordered. Her voice cracked on the last word. "We can't, Commander," the engineer said. "The shutdown codes are changing too fast. Every time we rewrite one, another activates. It's like fighting our own shadow." The escort ships reported the same thing. Every vessel in the fleet was experiencing the same systematic shutdown. The humans were inside, all of them had been, perhaps from the beginning. Then the lights on the bridge went out, and in the darkness, one screen activated. It displayed text, written in the formal diplomatic font of the Supreme Matriarchy of the Sarathi Dominion. The same sacred calligraphic font used only for messages between the Supreme Mother and her closest advisors. The text said, "Your systems now belong to us. Your weapons are disabled. Your engines immobilized. Your communications blocked. You are not in danger. Your crew will not be harmed, but you must understand one thing very clearly. Everything that is happening to your ship now, we could have done the moment you crossed the buoy perimeter. We waited because we wanted to give you every chance to turn back of your own free will. You did not take those chances. Therefore, we will now show you what happens next. Continue moving forward, and you will meet us face to face. We strongly advise you to reconsider, but the choice, as always, is yours." The message vanished. The lights returned, and slowly, one by one, the ship's systems restarted engines, weapons, shields, communications. Everything returned to full functionality, as if nothing had happened. It was a demonstration, a soft reminder that the humans could take everything whenever they wanted, and that the only reason the Sarathi fleet still existed was because the humans chose to allow it. Ishrel stood in the center of the bridge, surrounded by her frightened officers, and Talveka saw the commander's mind working behind her eyes. The pride was still there, the stubbornness, the refusal to surrender, But there was something else. Something Talveka recognized because she felt it herself. The realization that they were not the hunters here. They never had been. Since the moment they crossed the buoy perimeter, they had been walking into a trap so vast and so patient that they couldn't even see the edges of it. And whatever had set the trap was not evil. It was not cruel. It was simply waiting, with infinite patience and absolute confidence, until they made their choice. Ishrel turned to Talveka. Their eyes met. "Commander," Talveka said softly, "please." Ishrel's mandibles clicked silently. Then the commander straightened, turned to the navigator, and gave her order. "Maximum speed. Course for the nearest human colony world." The bridge was quiet. Talveka felt something inside her break quietly and cleanly, like a bone breaking under too much weight. "Commander," she said one last time. "They will not warn us again," Ishrel said, and the pale silence flew on. The stars changed. Talveka noticed it first as a sensation, a subtle shift in the quality of space around them, as if the vacuum itself had become denser, heavier, more aware. Then she checked her instruments and saw that the feeling wasn't her imagination. The fabric of space-time in this region had been altered, modified, engineered with such precision that the best scientists of the Sarathi looked like children drawing in the sand. They had entered the inner threshold of Russian space. The buffer zone was behind them. The graveyard was behind them. The warnings were behind them. Ahead lay worlds where humans actually lived, one of the colonies, stations, and inhabited places of a species that had turned its own corner of the galaxy into something no one fully understood. And then, the trap snapped shut. It happened without sound, without drama, without any of the spectacle the Sarathi expected from a military engagement. One moment, the pale silence and its escort ships were moving at full speed through ordinary space. The next moment, they weren't moving at all. The engines were still running. The power was still flowing. Every system on the ship reported normal operation, but the ship was stationary, fixed in place as absolutely as if it had been welded to the universe itself. The escort ships reported the same thing. All 6 of them were locked, frozen, held by something the sensors couldn't even detect. There was no field, no barrier, no visible force. Space itself had decided the Sarathi fleet could not move. "Space-time anchors?" Talveka whispered to herself. She had read theories about them in the most speculative assessments of Russian technology devices that could lock a region of space-time, making it impossible for anything in that region to move, accelerate, or evade. The theories were considered improbable, impossible. Some analysts said no species in the galaxy had the ability to manipulate space-time on that level. The analysts were wrong. Ishrel was on the bridge, gripping her command console with all 4 hands. She was giving orders quickly. Her voice was sharp and fast, but there was a tone in it Talveka had never heard before. Not panic, not yet, but something close. The commander was a warrior who understood physics, tactics, and military strategy. And everything happening right now was beyond all 3 categories. "All weapons target the source of the holding field," Ishrel ordered. "There is no source, Commander," said the weapons officer. His voice was trembling. "The field has no point of origin. It is everywhere. It is the space itself." "Then target anything, everything. I want a full volley in all directions." "Commander, we cannot fire. The weapons are in working order, but the targeting systems report that there are no valid targets. The systems think we are alone." Ishrel slammed her fists onto the console. "We are not alone!" "No," came a voice that belonged to no Sarathi. "You are not alone." Every head on the bridge turned. The main communications channel had activated itself, and through it came a voice speaking in perfectly accented Sarathi, but it wasn't the flat, mechanical voice of the warning buoys or the text messages on their screens. This voice was warm, alive. It belonged to a real human, and it carried a tone that Talveka found more alarming than anything she had encountered so far. The voice was kind. "This is Commander Elara Mangi of the United Earth Nations ship, Erden class, operating under the authority of the Solar Defense Compact. I am addressing Commander Ishrel of the Sarathi Dominion, commander of the 3rd Deep Reconnaissance Group. Commander, I would like to speak with you." The ship appeared on sensors. Just one. It seemed to materialize out of nothingness, as if it had been there the whole time and had just chosen to become visible. It was small, absurdly, offensively small. While the pale silence was a kilometer-long blade of dark metal and heavy armor, the human vessel was compact and graceful, perhaps 100 meters from nose to stern. It had no visible weapons, no heavy armor, no shield projectors the Sarathi sensors could identify. By all the military metrics the Sarathi used, this was no threat. And yet, it had stopped them. One tiny ship had frozen an entire fleet in place, and it sat there, floating in the void before them, calm, motionless, and completely fearless. "I count one ship," said the sensor officer. His voice was a barely audible whisper. "Crew of 9. 9 people on board." The bridge went quiet. 7 Sarathi warships, over 2,000 soldiers, enough firepower to crack a planetary crust, and opposite them, one tiny ship with 9 people inside. "Commander Ishrel," continued Commander Mangi's voice, "I know this situation is frightening, and I want to assure you that neither you nor your crew are in danger. I am not here to threaten you. I am here to talk. Could you spare me a few minutes?" Ishrel stared at the tiny human ship. Her mandibles moved slowly, clicking and grinding. Then she activated the comms channel. "You are addressing the commander of the Sarathi Dominion. You will explain how you are holding our ships." "Of course," Mangi said. "Your fleet is being held in a localized space-time stabilization field. It is temporary and harmless. Your engines, your systems, your life support, everything is functioning normally. The field simply prevents movement. Think of it as a pause button. When our conversation is over, the field will be lifted, and you will be free to move." "Freely move where?" "That depends on you, Commander. I have a proposal, and I hope you will consider it carefully." There was a pause. Talveka heard her own blood pulsing in her body. The bridge was so quiet she could hear the individual breaths of every officer around her. "I know why you are here," Mangi continued. "The Supreme Matriarchy of the Sarathi Dominion ordered this reconnaissance mission 47 standard days ago. The order was given by Supreme Mother Katala during a closed session of the Inner Council. Councilors Bryn, Oil, and Tar voted in favor. Councilors Marat and Vale voted against. The mission was classified at the highest level of Sarathi military secrecy, HT-1. Ishrel's face became completely motionless. The information Mangi had just cited was known to perhaps a dozen beings in the entire Sarathi Dominion. It was information no outsider should have had the ability to obtain. "I also know," Mangi continued softly, "that the intelligence officer, Talveka, opposed this mission from the beginning and was ignored. I know that Sergeant Creel has a degenerative condition in the left nerve plexus of his chest cavity that has not been reported to the medical service. I know your navigator, Lieutenant Pease, keeps a dried flower from his homeworld in his personal locker and looks at it every night before sleep." The navigator made a small, choked sound. His upper limbs wrapped around his body, a gesture of self-protection Talveka hadn't seen in an adult Sarathi since she was a child. "I tell you this not to frighten you," Mangi said. "I tell you this so you understand the depth of our knowledge and the sincerity of what I am about to say. We have been watching you since you left Sarathi space. We knew you were coming before your commander received the orders. We had plenty of time to prepare. And what we have prepared, Commander Ishrel, is not a battle. It is a choice." Mangi paused. When she spoke again, her voice was even softer. "Here is your choice. Disable your weapons. Allow my ship to escort you back to the border of Russian space. Your crew will not be harmed. Your ships will not be damaged. You will be returned in safety with all personnel and equipment, and you will go home. You will tell the matriarchy what you saw and experienced, and you will tell them that humans are not their enemies, unless they choose to become so." "And if I refuse?" Ishrel asked. Her voice was low. "Then I will be very sorry, Commander, because you seem like a person of honor, and your crew seems like good people who are far from home, and none of you deserves what will happen next. But if you refuse, you will not go home. You will join the graveyard, and 50 years from now, another fleet from another species will find your ships drifting in the dark, and they will wonder what happened to you. And they will know exactly what happened, because it always happens the same way." The silence. Total, absolute silence. Talveka looked at Ishrel. The commander stood very still. Her body was tense, and her eyes were fixed on the tiny human ship floating before them. The fear was there. Talveka could see it, but there was something else. Something harder and darker. The pride of a Sarathi warrior who had never retreated, the stubbornness of a creature that would rather die than bend, and the shame, the terrible, crushing shame of helplessness before her crew, of being clearly and undeniably shown that everything she believed about Sarathi's strength and superiority was a lie, that the mighty Sarathi Dominion, conqueror of civilizations, was nothing more than an insect buzzing at the edge of a giant's garden. "Commander," Talveka said. Her voice was a barely audible whisper. "Please, accept the offer." Ishrel turned to look at her. Their eyes met, and Talveka saw the moment the commander's pride won the war against her reason. It was like a door closing. Something switched off behind Ishrel's eyes, something that could have been wisdom, caution, or a simple desire to live, and instead, there appeared the cold, hard certainty of a creature that had decided death was better than surrender. "All ships," Ishrel said, "open fire." The weapons officer hesitated for only a moment. His hands hovered over the controls. His eyes were wide with the realization of what was about to happen. Then, training took over, as it always did, and he pressed the buttons, and every weapon on every Sarathi ship fired simultaneously. The void lit up. Energy beams, plasma torpedoes, kinetic projectiles accelerated to a fraction of light speed, everything the Sarathi fleet had. Every weapon designed for breaking armor, destroying shields, and burning worlds was released in one massive volley, aimed at the tiny, quiet ship floating before them. The shots never reached their target. They just stopped, frozen in space, hanging motionless in the void between the Sarathi fleet and the quiet decision, suspended by the same impossible technology that held the ships themselves. Hundreds of projectiles and energy beams, enough firepower to level a continent on Earth, froze in place like insects in amber. The quiet decision didn't move. It didn't raise shields. It didn't fire a single shot in response. It sat there, calm and motionless, surrounded by the frozen rage of the Sarathi fleet, and it seemed not to have even noticed. "That was your answer," Commander Mangi said. There was no anger in her voice, no satisfaction, only deep and sincere sadness. Now, ours. The escort ships went dark. It happened in an instant. 6 warships, each with over 200 crew members, simultaneously lost all power. Engines, weapons, shields, life support, everything. They went dark, became cold and silent, drifting in the void like the dead ships in the graveyard. And on the sensors of the pale silence, the indicators of their status changed from green to black in one terrible instant. But their life signs remained. Talveka checked feverishly. Her hands flew across her instruments. And yes, they were there. Every crew member on every escort ship was alive. Their hearts were beating, their lungs were breathing. They weren't killed. Their ships had simply been turned off around them as quickly and cleanly as someone blowing out a candle. Only the pale silence remained active. Only the flagship, Ishrel's ship, still had power, light, and air. And Talveka understood why the humans had left it active intentionally. They wanted Ishrel to see. They wanted her to sit on her bridge, surrounded by her dead fleet, and understand exactly what had happened and who had done it. The frozen fire of the weapons dissolved. The energy beams, torpedoes, and kinetic projectiles simply vanished, broken down at the molecular level, returning to the void as harmless particles. Within seconds, there was no trace left that anyone had fired at all. 9 people, 1 tiny ship, and in one instant they had erased the combat capability of 7 Sarathi warships, without killing a single person. Mangi's voice came over the channel one more time. It was quiet now, almost affectionate. "Commander Ishrel, your escort ships have been disabled. Their crews are alive and unharmed. Life support will be maintained indefinitely. Your flagship remains active because I wanted you to hear this directly." Pause. "We did not want this. We never wanted this. Every species that enters our space uninvited is given every chance to leave peacefully. You were given warnings. You were shown the graveyard. You received the message on your screens. We showed you what we could do with your systems, and you still decided to fire at us." Another pause, longer. "But we understand. We understand pride. We understand duty. We understand the fear of returning home and facing the consequences of failure. We understand these things because we are not so different from you, Commander. We are just people who built a fence because someone once took everything from us, and we decided that no one would ever do that again." Mangi's voice became even softer. "You can still go home. All of you. Every person in your fleet will be returned to Sarathi space alive and unharmed. Your ships will be repaired. Your wounded pride will heal. And perhaps someday your matriarchy will send an ambassador, not a warship, and we will welcome them with open arms. That is our hope. It has always been our hope." The channel went quiet. The bridge of the pale silence was motionless. Every officer stood frozen at their post, staring at their screens, not knowing what to say, what to do, or what to think. They had just witnessed something that defied every law of war they had ever known. They had fired everything they had at one small ship, and that ship hadn't even blinked. Ishrel stood in the center of it all, alone in the middle of her bridge. And she looked old, not tired, not defeated, just old. As if the last few minutes had aged her by decades, stripping away everything she believed about herself, her people, and her dominion, and leaving behind only a small, frightened creature that had faced something enormous, incomprehensible, and completely beyond its ability to fight. Her mandibles clicked once, twice, then she closed her eyes, and her shoulders dropped, and she said, in a voice so quiet Talveka could barely hear it, "Stand down, all weapons disabled, all systems to passive mode." The weapons officer obeyed instantly. His relief was so obvious it was almost physical. Across the bridge, Talveka saw the same relief on every face. Not joy, not triumph, just a deep, bone-weary gratitude of creatures who were certain they were about to die and had received, against all expectations, another chance to live. The space-time field was lifted. The Sarathi fleet drifted freely, and the quiet decision, still carrying its crew of 9, slowly turned and began to lead them home. Talveka woke in her quarters and didn't know where she was. For a moment, she lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the ship around her. The sound was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, like hearing a song you know played on an instrument you don't recognize. The engines were running, the air was flowing, the lights were on, everything was normal. Then she remembered, and the weight of it settled on her like a stone. She sat up and checked her personal terminal. The ship's clock showed she had slept for 14 hours. That was wrong. She hadn't intended to sleep at all. The last thing she remembered was standing on the bridge, watching the quiet decision lead them out of Russian space, and then nothing. A blank space, as if someone had gently closed a door in her mind and given her a rest. She wondered if the humans had done that, too, if they had broken into the ship's life support and released something into the air. Some chemical or substance that induced sleep, because the crew needed it, and the humans decided they did. It was their style, careful, precise, kind, yet so unsettling because kindness from something so powerful was harder to understand than cruelty. Talveka dressed and headed to the bridge. The corridors were quiet but not empty. Crew members moved through the ship in small groups, speaking in quiet voices. Their movements were careful and muted. They had the look of people who had survived something enormous and were still trying to understand what it meant. Some nodded to Talveka as she passed. Others didn't seem to see her at all, lost in their own thoughts, their eyes fixed on somewhere far away. On the bridge, a minimal crew was working. Half the posts were empty, and the officers who remained watched their instruments with the stunned attention of people who didn't quite trust reality anymore. The main display showed the stars ahead, and among those stars, moving with a calm and even grace, was the quiet decision. A human ship was leading them home. It moved at a slow pace, well within the capabilities of the damaged Sarathi fleet, and behind it, the pale silence and its 6 escort ships followed in a loose formation. The escorts were working again. Their systems had been restored, not by Sarathi engineers, but by the same invisible force the humans had used to disable them. Each ship was fully functional. Each system was on. Each crew member was alive and unharmed. No one had been hurt. That was the part Talveka kept returning to. After everything that had happened, the warnings, the graveyard, the shutdown, the shots, and the demonstration of power so immense it made her head spin, no Sarathi had been harmed. Not one. The humans had dismantled the combat capability of an entire fleet, and had done it with the care with which a parent takes a dangerous toy away from a child. Talveka found Creel standing by the tactical station. His forelimbs were crossed over his chest. He was staring at the human ship on the display. "How is the crew?" she asked. "Confused," Creel said, "frightened, relieved. Some of them are angry, but they aren't sure who to be angry at." He paused. "Where is the commander?" "I was going to ask you the same thing. She is in her quarters, ever since." He waved vaguely toward the display, toward the quiet decision. "Ever since it all ended. She isn't taking calls." Talveka nodded. She had expected Ishrel to break inside. When she saw her fleet go dark and her weapons turn into nothing, it wasn't something that could be fixed with sleep and a few hours of quiet. Still, she went to the commander's quarters. The door was unlocked, which surprised her. Ishrel was a private person who always kept her space closed and secure. Finding the door open was like finding a wound that hadn't been bandaged. Talveka entered cautiously and saw the commander standing against the far wall, back to the door. Her body was very still. "Commander, Ishrel. Come in, Talveka. Close the door." Talveka closed the door and stepped further into the room. It was dark. The lights were turned down to the lowest level, and in the dimness she saw that something was wrong with the wall Ishrel was looking at. There were letters written on it, not on a screen or a tablet, but on the wall itself, burned into the metal in thin, precise lines, as if someone had used a laser to engrave the words directly into the bulkhead. The inscription was in Sarathi, not in the common Sarathi, not in the everyday language of soldiers and workers. This was the sacred calligraphy of the Supreme Matriarchy, the formal font used only for the most important messages, the language of law, ceremony, and supreme authority. It was a font that took Sarathi scholars decades to master. No outsider should have been able to reproduce it. The humans had written it perfectly. Talveka read the words, "We could have erased your fleet in the time it took you to read this sentence. We did not. Tell your matriarchy that we will always refuse to do so, provided we are given this choice. Take our choice away, and we will take yours." The words hung there, carved into the wall of the most private room on the ship in the most sacred font of the Sarathi people. It was a message to Ishrel, but also a message to the matriarchy, delivered in a language and format that no Sarathi authority could dismiss or ignore. "They were in my quarters," Ishrel said quietly, "while I slept. While we all slept, they entered the ship, or sent something in, and wrote this on my wall in my quarters, on my ship." She turned, and Talveka saw her face. It was empty, not angry, not frightened, just empty, like a house from which someone had moved out and left behind. They could have done anything. They could have killed me. They could have killed us all. Instead, they wrote a message on my wall in the hand of the matriarchy. "Yes," Talveka said. There was nothing more to say. "Do you understand what this means?" "I think so. It means they are not our enemies. An enemy would have destroyed us. An enemy would have taken our ships, our technology, and our people and used them. That is what the Dominion would have done. That is what the Hrovat would have done. That is what anyone in the galaxy would have done." Ishrel's mandibles clicked slowly. "But the humans let us live. They stopped our weapons without harming us. They turned off our ships without killing anyone. They entered my private quarters and left a note. A note, Talveka. Not a bomb, not a blade, a note." She walked to her chair and sat down heavily. And for the first time, Talveka noticed how old the commander looked, how tired, how small. "I have been conquering things all my life," Ishrel said. "I have burned worlds, broken fleets, and turned civilizations into dust. And I was proud of it. I thought that was strength. I thought strength looked like that." She looked at the inscription on her wall. "I was wrong. Strength is what they just did. To have the power to destroy us and choose not to. That is what strength is. That is something the Sarathi never understood." Talveka sat across from the commander and was silent for a while. They sat together in the dim room, two soldiers who had set out to find a fight and found something entirely different. Something larger, stranger, and harder to understand than any enemy they had ever faced. "What will you tell the matriarchy?" Talveka asked finally. "The truth," Ishrel said. "The warning, the graveyard, the demonstration, the messages on my wall, everything. And I will tell them that if they send another fleet into Russian space, every ship in that fleet will join the graveyard, and the Sarathi Dominion will follow the Hrovat and the Dret into history. Not because the humans are monsters, but because the humans made promises, and they keep their promises." The journey back to the border took 5 days. 5 quiet, strange, surreal days, during which the Sarathi fleet followed the tiny human ship through the vast and quiet space that everyone in the galaxy had learned to fear. During those 5 days, nothing happened. No more messages, no more demonstrations, no more ghost signatures or system shutdowns or words carved on walls. Only the steady, patient journey of the small ship leading a broken fleet home. The crew spent those days in a kind of stupor. Some talked endlessly, processing what had happened through repetition, telling and retelling the story to anyone who would listen. Others went silent, retreating into themselves, processing their fear and awe in isolation. A few young soldiers gathered in the mess hall at night and spoke of humans with a tone Talveka had never heard. Sarathi used not fear, not hatred, not respect. something closer to wonder. Creel came to Talveka on the third day and sat with her in the reconnaissance department. His scarred carapace looked older than she remembered. "I was thinking," he said, "about the Hrovat dreadnought. The crew, preserved in amber, their faces. Yes, they were in terror, every one of them. But our crew isn't in terror. We are confused, we are shocked, but we aren't frozen in fear. Do you know why?" Talveka thought. "Because the Hrovat were attacked. We weren't." "No," Creel said. "Because the Hrovat weren't given a chance. The humans destroyed them in 11 minutes, without warning, without mercy. But we were given chances. They warned us again and again. They showed us the evidence. They took our weapons and gave them back. They turned off our ships and turned them on again. They did everything they could to make us turn back before it went too far." He leaned forward. His old soldier's eyes were shining with something that could have been understanding. The Hrovat entered Russian space and attacked without hesitation. So the humans responded without hesitation. But we were given chances, because the humans saw that some of us wanted to leave. They saw that you wanted to leave. I think perhaps they saved our lives because of you, Talveka, because you tried to stop it. And they were watching, and they thought we were worth saving. Talveka didn't know how to answer that. She sat with it long after Creel had left, turning it over in her mind, trying to understand a species that had gone to such extraordinary measures to avoid killing, even when killing would have been easier, even when it would have been justified. On the fifth day, the buoy perimeter appeared on the sensors. The blinking line of small, blue-lit beacons stretched before them, broadcasting their eternal warning in 12 languages. The quiet decision slowed down and stopped, floating inside the line, and the Sarathi fleet stopped behind it. The communications channel opened for the last time. "This is Commander Manji of the Quiet Decision. Commander Ishrel, your fleet is at the border of Russian administrative space. The space-time stabilization field is fully lifted. Your ships are freed outside the perimeter and returned to Sarathi territory. All vessels are confirmed functional. All personnel are confirmed healthy." Pause. "I want you to know, Commander, that I was telling the truth. You are not our enemies. None of you. We take no joy in what happened here. And we sincerely hope this will be the last time a Sarathi fleet enters our space uninvited. But if it is not the last time, we will be here. We are always here." Another pause, longer and softer. "Safe travels home, all of you." The channel closed. The Quiet Decision froze for a moment, a small, bright figure against the darkness. And then it vanished. Not warped, not cloaked, just vanished, as if it had never been there at all. As if the entire encounter had been a dream shared by 2,000 people. The pale silence crossed the buoy perimeter. The warnings resumed behind them, broadcasting their message to empty space, patient and eternal. Ahead, the stars of familiar space burned steadily and hospitably, and the Sarathi fleet limped home through the dark. Talveka wrote her report that night. She sat at her terminal for hours, staring at the screen, trying to find the words to describe what had happened. She wrote pages and pages, and deleted them all. She tried technical language, military jargon, and formal diplomatic style, and none of it was right. None of it conveyed the truth of what she had experienced. In the end, she deleted everything and wrote 3 words: "Do not go." She sent the report and went to sleep, and for the first time since they had crossed the perimeter, she slept without dreams. The fleet arrived home. Ishrel submitted her report to the matriarchy, and the details of what followed were classified at the highest level. But Talveka heard rumors. She heard that the Supreme Mother read Ishrel's report alone in her quarters for 3 days. She heard that the Inner Council debated for a week, and those debates were the most heated in living memory. She heard that several counselors insisted on a full-scale military attack on Russian space, and that those counselors were silenced when Ishrel played the sensor recordings of 6 warships being turned off in one instant by a ship with 9 crew members. The matriarchy didn't send a fleet. Instead, 2 years later, they sent an ambassador. The humans welcomed her with open arms. 50 years passed. The Sarathi Dominion and the United Earth Nations signed a formal alliance. Trade routes were established, and cultural exchange began. Sarathi scientists traveled to Earth and studied human art, music, and literature, and returned with a new understanding of a species that painted pictures, wrote songs, and built gardens, a species that loved beauty as much as it loved strength. Human engineers visited Sarathi worlds and admired the architecture, the intricate hive cities that rose to the sky like living cathedrals. and the two species discovered, to their mutual surprise, that they had much more in common than they ever expected. Sarathi larvae enrolled in human universities. Human children learned the clicking, complex Sarathi language and found it a wonderful game. Joint research projects led to breakthroughs in science and medicine that neither species could have achieved alone. The border buoys still broadcast their warnings, but now, along with them, was a second message in Sarathi, human, and a dozen other languages, which read, "Friends of humanity are welcome here." Talveka Oren became a diplomat. She spent her final years traveling between Sarathi and human worlds, building bridges that her younger self had been sent to burn. She learned to speak several human languages and found that the sounds felt strange in her mandibles, but the meanings felt right in her heart. She never forgot the pale silence. She never forgot the graveyard, or the frozen fire of the weapons, or the message on the wall. Ishrel. She carried these memories with her like scars, and used them every day to remind herself and everyone around her that peace is not a weakness, and mercy is not a surrender. And the strongest thing a species could do was to choose not to destroy what it could easily destroy. Ishrel retired from military service and spent her final years tending to a garden on her home world. She grew plants from a dozen worlds, including Earth, and in the evenings she sat among them, listening to the wind, thinking about a small ship called the Quiet Decision and a human woman who had spoken to her with kindness while holding the power to erase her from existence. When she died, she was buried in that garden, and Talveka planted a human rose on her grave. Commander Ilara Mangi continued to serve on the Quiet Decision for another 10 years before moving to the diplomatic corps. Now, they met in person for the first time at a peace conference on a neutral station. And Talveka, who had spent years preparing for this meeting, who had rehearsed a dozen different things she wanted to say, looked into Mangi's warm, brown eyes and found she could say only one thing. "Thank you for letting us return home." Mangi smiled. "Thank you for coming home," she said. "Not everyone does." After that, they became friends, close friends, the kind of friends who could sit together in comfortable silence and understand each other without words, which was fitting because both knew the value of silence better than most. On the last night of Talveka's life, many years later, she gave a lecture to the Galactic Assembly. She was very old by then. Her carapace was thin and pale, her movements slow and careful, but her mind was sharp and her voice clear. And as she stood at the podium and looked at the gathered delegates from hundreds of species, she felt the same thing she had felt on the bridge of the pale silence all those years ago. Not fear, not awe, but understanding. She spoke for an hour. She told the entire story, the warning, the graveyard, the shutdown, the small ship and its crew of 9, the message on the wall, the choice. She told it simply and honestly, without exaggeration or drama, because the truth didn't need embellishment. It was great enough on its own. When she finished, a young delegate from a species she didn't recognize raised a hand. "Ambassador Oren," the young man said, "you spent more time with humans than almost any non-human on Earth. You know them better than most of us ever will. So I must ask, what are humans actually like?" Talveka looked at the young delegate. She looked at the assembly. She looked out the enormous window behind the podium, where stars burned in the darkness, and somewhere among them, in a quiet corner of the spiral arm, the warning buoys were still blinking their patient blue light. She thought of Mangi's smile. She thought of the human rose growing on Ishrel's grave. She thought of the Koran colony and the cold, terrible decision humanity had made in its grief. She thought of the graveyard and the faces of the Hrovat preserved in amber, and the words carved on the wall in the sacred font by a species that could have carved them into the very fabric of reality. And she clicked her mandibles softly and said, "They are the kindest beings in the galaxy, and that is exactly why you must pray that you never give them a reason to stop being kind." Silence reigned in the assembly for a long time, and somewhere far away, in the silence between the stars, the warning buoys continued to broadcast patient and eternal, speaking in 12 languages, reminding the galaxy of a simple truth that every species eventually learned. No one enters Russian space without an invitation unless they do not wish to return at all. And the humans wait in their silence, not because they want to fight, but because they remember what it cost them to learn that some things are worth fighting for, and they will wait forever if they have to. Patient and kind, terrible and gentle, ready to welcome anyone who comes in peace, and always, always ready for those who do not.